I apologize. Okay,
Okay. No,
so my name is Jan Olsen. So I've been giving the challenge of trying to explain the role of living labs as a research tool, opportunities and limitations. I mean, there are probably many different versions eventually of living labs, but I think the reason also why we are looking into this is because we have these great challenges that sort of go beyond what we have for many years just been focusing on, so to speak, increasing production and so forth, where there are many additional challenges and objectives that we need to deal with in modern agriculture because because we want to address the sustainability challenges, which is not just the climate or environment, it's also the biodiversity, it's reducing inputs, it's dealing with the increasingly complex issues such as addressing the land use and what we otherwise use land for, but at the same time, of course, also increasing the production, or at least increasing the supply of food, bioenergy, biomaterials, and so on. And at the same time, of course, also making this agriculture and the food industry as a source of jobs and growth. In Denmark, we've been developing a roadmap for the research and innovation. We did that last year. Now we are going into an implementation phase on this, and here we separate it for different topics, but in particular the land use, the land management is particularly important, and I also think from a living lab perspective, addressing these multiple challenges. We also try to look at the how we see the agriculture, agri-food complex, and where new technologies, new management needs to come in. Also addressing the land use and management, the plant-based food, the animal food production and biotech and so on. And you can see it's complex. Because on top of all of this, there is the political regulations. There's also a multitude of stakeholders involved here. And there's a large variation, of course, also in the actors here, being influenced through value change, being influenced by local conditions, profitability, and what else have you. Addressing this eventually requires many different actors, researchers, and so forth working together. And Living Lab has come up as a potential for looking more sort of directly at how can we make things change in reality. But what is it really? I mean, I looked into Wikipedia, and it says it's a research concept which is defined as being user-centered, iterative, open innovation, often operating in a territorial context, so this could be a farm, but integrating concurrent research and innovation processes in a public-private people partnership. So that's a generic. It could also work with cities and elsewhere. In some of the work we've recently been looking into in terms of agroecosystems, we've defined living labs as a transdisciplinary approaches that involves farmers, scientists, and other interested partners in the co-design, monitoring, and evaluation of new and existing agricultural practices and technologies on working landscapes to improve their effectiveness and early adoption. So what this stresses actually here, the last one definition we have here, is that we need to speed up processes of innovation and adoption. This comes actually at a bit higher TRL levels. So we would still have researchers working in the lab and so on, and not in these living labs, but in other labs. But when we are having prototypes and so on available, addressing them and further develop them in living labs is seen as one of the ways forward. But why do we need them? Well, basically it's because we want to speed up the green transition and any other sort of transitions that we need, because it requires that we effectively deal with the barriers to adoption and also further developing the technologies so that they become ready for the market. And much of that can better be done by that integration in a real case situation between, for instance, farmers and researchers. Also, often the adoption of technologies are context specific, so there might be issues that need to be dealt with in particular contexts. It's also necessary to adjust and adopt new technology management with the involvement of users. So that's the co-creation part of thing. So I think there's many types and scales of living labs, and I don't think you should just be saying, okay, this is just at a farm scale. Of course, that would in many cases be so, but because that would involve maybe developing new management, new technologies for growing crops or raising the livestock or dealing with the manure, whatever. But it's also related to industry, facilities, and so on, often where this would then, in an agricultural context, involve many farmers that deliver their produce, for instance, to it could be a biogas or biorefining plant, and maybe also where you have a circularity aspect to it, involving also multiple uses of the produce that is coming from the farmer, and where there's also a need to collectively sort of design the flows of biomass and develop ways to produce this. There could also be regional aspects of this, primarily often dealing with governance, whether you want to manage a catchment for water or nutrients, or manage a landscape with the multiple functions that landscapes have. Besides the productivity aspect, could be recreation, biodiversity, many other uses where there would be additional actors and stakeholders involved. So doing so, from a research perspective, requires interdisciplinarity. So that would then involve a range of scientific competences, of course, depending on the actual situation. So besides natural sciences and engineers, you'll need also researchers that are knowledgeable on business or policy or how humans work. Because this has actually the involvement of people. Working actually with actors means you also need to work with people. So I think this is where we do move, in my view, beyond the typical natural science or engineering focus to where we also have the concern for how people react. This requires also willingness among researchers and others to work together, but also with the researchers to work across disciplines. The experience is this often requires quite some time in learning the basics of other disciplines, so that you can actually have a working language that also is needed for effectively working in a living lab. So what's the role of science here when we're looking at living labs? Well, it is to support innovation and going into the co-design process also here with the knowledge that is that stays with the researchers and scientists being involved, but also to document effects. In particular, when we come to many of these sustainability impacts here, which are often actually quite difficult eventually to document in reality. It's often complex to do so, but also to analyze barriers for adoption, and also to come with proposals of how they can actually be overcome. And of course, it's to generate learnings for other actors and for society in general. And eventually, of course, it should be kept in mind that the objective of actually doing the science in the living labs eventually is to speed up the process of the green transition, but in a meaningful way, so that what we are actually developing here has impact and is both efficient and effective. Let me give you a few examples of what we've been working with, also in Denmark, in considering what we can do at the land management, land use and management, where we're thinking of changes in landscape structure, changes in functions and management, and how we ensure governance to facilitate change. And I would say that across all of these three components, living labs would have a potentially great role to play there. They should all, of course, be delivering on multiple impacts. To illustrate what we're looking at in terms of cropping systems, so this is about the functions and management that we have here. We're looking into arable cropping, forage cropping, perennial cropping systems, and the management. When you see the management, this is very much about looking into particular technologies, whereas if we look at some of the cropping systems and so on, it's changing the way we consider crops and also manage the crops in the landscape. That's, of course, a great deal of interaction here, and this is where testing this in reality and doing that in living labs becomes really important. So this is, of course, also where much of that this year would involve co-design processes. I think that's equally important to consider governance aspects also when we consider living labs. Some of this, of course, is having developing systems that are smart, and which you can also think of developing in such a way that they would generate revenue, for instance, with certifications and so on. But it's also documenting services and functions where you often move to beyond farm to landscape scales as well. And the dialogue that is needed for this, for instance, to increase the overall biodiversity of landscapes, involves dialogues with stakeholders, for instance, in discussing the issues of land sparing and sharing for different types of uses of the landscape. There's also issues around restoring natural and dynamic processes in landscapes, where also that dialogue would be greatly needed. What we've been considering is that we really need new concepts for working with this, and such concepts which could involve many different aspects, both from monitoring, but also to the involvement of the multiple stakeholders in landscapes, for instance, in a regional living lab, would as well be very beneficial. However, living labs is only one among many research tools, and as I initially mentioned, at the higher TRL level, we still need all of the other research tools as well. And we need a way by which we can have a feedback from the knowledge that we gain when working with actors in the Living Lab to the other research that we're doing, so that we can have sort of also an innovation and learning loop here. But let me finish with a bit of reflections on the challenges from a research perspective that I think we would also have when working with living labs. Because when we do this type of research and sort of documenting that things actually work, we often need a reference against which we can measure whether we're doing improvements or not. And this is often going to be challenging working in real life situations, unless, of course, you make dedicated experiments there, which is, of course, also possible. So whether such changes that we are looking at is sufficiently well defined may also be an issue. And in particular, if you work in real life situations where things may sort of constantly change. So how do you actually separate sort of variability in the system that you have from what you've been effecting with the changes in management or technologies? There's also an issue of the entire issue of co-design processes, because what is the role of the researcher there? Is it well defined? Because there's also risk of researchers are also people, and becoming highly involved in given situations, and living labs may actually mean that you also become emotionally involved. So there's a need that you have some sort of arm's length so that you can maintain objectivity, at least when it comes to the evaluations and assessments that you need to be doing. Technologies, methods, are they actually available for measuring and documenting effects at the scale of the living lab? This may actually take new developments of such methodologies. And how do we actually report and publish from living lab studies? There may actually be a need also to consider standards for this, considering all of these other challenges that we have here. But in particular, I think there's this need for interdisciplinarity, and that should not, the challenge of this should not be underestimated in terms of actually working on efforts for the cross-disciplinary understanding of the research groups that are involved with such living lab studies. That's all for me.
Okay, thank you,